The house smelled like cinnamon and dust when I saw it. My own kitchen. My own face. Mocked for the world to see. The laughter in those comments was louder than any sound in the room, echoing in my chest until it hurt to breathe. My hands shook, but not from anger, from something colder. If you've ever been humiliated by someone you once called family, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. There's a kind of silence that follows public shame. It doesn't break you all at once. It erases you, inch by inch. Let me show you how I found my voice again. It was a little after 2:30 p.m. when I saw it, a photo I never agreed to share, floating across my phone screen like a slap I never saw coming. My face was circled in red, my name tagged in a dozen comments, and the caption was something cruel disguised as a joke. It was Lindsay's post, my daughter-in-law. She'd written something about entitled mothers-in-law who forget whose house they live in. The image was taken in my own kitchen, at my own table. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled so badly that I almost dropped the phone. The light from the window felt too sharp, too bright, cutting across the counter where I used to make breakfast for them. It wasn't just a post. It was a public stripping of my dignity. I could see friends, neighbors, even old coworkers reacting with emojis and laughter. It was like watching pieces of my life being peeled away one by one. I remember standing there, frozen, wondering when kindness became weakness, when my silence turned into permission. They had taken my generosity and twisted it into a punchline. The hurt sank deep, but beneath it, something else began to rise. A quiet resolve. I'd spent years thinking that love meant staying quiet, forgiving, letting things slide. But in that moment, I realized I'd been living inside a story they were writing for me, one where I was the fool. Not anymore. The truth is, that house they were mocking me from wasn't theirs. It was mine. And that's where this story really begins. Charleston has always had a way of holding the past in its air. The salt from the harbor, the magnolias that bloom stubbornly each spring. When Henry and I first moved here, it felt like the kind of place where love could last forever. We built our life slowly, like brickwork, patient, steady, proud of every piece we laid together. Our son, Mark, was our only child. He was quiet like Henry, thoughtful, the kind of boy who always asked how others were doing before talking about himself. When he met Lindsay, I remember thinking she brought light into his life. She was young, ambitious, and full of ideas about how she and Mark would take on the world. Henry adored her. He said she reminded him of me when we were newly married, fierce and hopeful. In those early years, our family felt whole. Holidays were loud and happy. The smell of Henry's roast, the children's laughter echoing through the hallway. It all felt like the kind of joy that could never be touched. When Mark and Lindsay started struggling financially after their second child was born, Henry and I didn't even hesitate. We bought the house they live in now, not as a gift, but as a foundation. We told ourselves it was an investment in family, in their future. The deed was placed in my name, but I never once thought of it as mine alone. I just wanted to see them happy, to give them what we once built for ourselves. But after Henry passed, something began to change. The warmth in Lindsay's voice softened into politeness, and then into something colder, distance wrapped in courtesy. Suddenly, I wasn't Mom anymore. I became Evelyn. Small things began to sting: the way she corrected how I folded towels, how she'd serve dinner without asking if I was hungry, how my favorite chair was moved to make space for new furniture I didn't recognize. I told myself it was just adjustment, new routines, new grief, the weight of responsibility. But sometimes, when I looked around the home I'd helped them build, I could feel my place shrinking. The photos on the wall shifted subtly. Family pictures where I once stood beside Henry began to feature just Mark and his children. The kitchen I had painted with my own hands was now filled with Lindsay's touches. Sleek, modern, cold. I was grateful they let me stay. That's what I told myself. Grateful to be part of their lives, even in the background. I kept cooking Sunday dinners, folding their laundry, tending to the garden Henry had loved so much. But sometimes, when I'd see them laughing together, I'd feel like a guest in my own story, like the home had accepted them and forgotten me. Looking back now, I realize it was never just about the house. It was about belonging, about love slowly turning into tolerance. And I had no idea that the home Henry and I gave them out of love would one day become the weapon they used to humiliate me. It was a Sunday morning when it happened. I was standing by the window, watching the sunlight spill across the magnolia tree in the front yard, when my neighbor, Carol, came to the door. She looked uneasy, her phone clutched tight in her hand. I remember the hesitation in her eyes before she turned the screen toward me. There it was, a photo taken in my own kitchen. My face caught mid-expression, my hair uncombed, my posture tired, a red circle drawn around me like I was some kind of exhibit. The caption underneath was a knife hidden behind a smile. Something about freeloaders who overstay their welcome. And right beneath it, Lindsay's name, my daughter-in-law. The comments came next, like pebbles thrown against glass. Laughter, emojis. Little jabs that stung more because they came from people I once greeted on the sidewalk. People who'd eaten at my table. I could feel the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled so badly, I had to set the phone down. For a few seconds, all I could hear was my own breathing, shallow, quick, uneven. The house around me felt unfamiliar, like the walls were leaning in to listen. The sunlight that had looked so gentle a moment ago now felt harsh, exposing every flaw, every wrinkle, every trace of age I had once worn with quiet pride. Then I saw something that broke me even deeper. Mark's name under the post, not in defense of me, not even a simple word of protest, just a heart emoji. That was the moment it truly sank in. My son had seen it, and he said nothing. I stood there, staring at that small, glowing screen, and it felt like my entire life had folded in on itself. I wasn't just humiliated, I was erased. The woman who had cooked every meal, held every crying grandchild, paid every property tax bill, now reduced to a joke for strangers. For hours, I sat in silence, too stunned to cry. My chest ached with something I didn't recognize. Not just sadness, but a kind of grief that went beyond losing a husband or a home. It was the grief of realizing that the people you love most can strip away your dignity while smiling in your direction. But somewhere in that silence, beneath the ache and humiliation, something inside me stirred. A small, steady voice that whispered through the noise enough. I realized I had spent years making myself smaller to keep peace, staying quiet so others could stay comfortable. And where had that silence led me to this? A public display of cruelty I had helped build by never setting a boundary. That day, I made a quiet promise not to shout, not to seek revenge, but to remind them who I truly was. I would reclaim my voice, my dignity, and my place in this home. They thought they could erase me. They forgot one thing. The foundation they stood on was mine, and soon they would remember it. That night, I sat in the quiet of the living room long after the lights outside had gone dim. The house felt different now, colder, somehow heavier. Every corner held a piece of me, yet it felt like I was trespassing in my own home. The faint smell of lemon polish lingered on the furniture, the same brand I'd used for decades. I traced my fingers along the armrest of Henry's old chair, the wood worn smooth from years of use. It was strange how a home could hold your love and your heartbreak at the same time. For a long while, I just sat there, letting the silence settle over me. My mind replayed the image of that cruel post, the red circle around my face, the mocking words, the laughter. Each time I thought about it, the shame burned a little less, replaced by something quieter, steadier, a kind of understanding. Henry's voice came back to me, not in sound, but in memory. I could almost see him on the porch, his coffee in hand, talking about responsibility and roots. He used to say a family is only as strong as the ground it stands on. That was why we bought this house all those years ago. Not for ourselves, but for Mark, for the life we hoped he'd build. We wanted him to have a place where his children could grow up safe, where laughter could echo against these walls the way ours once did. As I thought about those early days, the paperwork flashed in my mind, our signatures, the notary's seal. The deed had been placed in my name, simply because it was easier at the time. Henry had said it didn't matter whose name was written. What mattered was the love that built it. But now, sitting there in the half-light, I realized that piece of paper still carried weight. My name hadn't disappeared. It was still there, quietly, undeniably mine. A slow calm began to fill me, not the kind that comes from vengeance or pride, but from remembering who I am. I had given them everything, time, love, a home, and they mistook that giving for weakness. But Henry once told me that kindness is never weakness. It's strength misunderstood. I stood and walked toward the porch. The magnolia tree we planted together was blooming again, its white flowers heavy with scent. I remembered planting it with my bare hands, laughing as Henry teased me for digging too deep. That tree had weathered every storm since, its roots thick and certain, just like mine. As the night air brushed against my skin, I felt something shift inside me. The humiliation, the grief, the years of silence, all of it folded into a single, quiet truth I didn't need to fight for respect. I already owned it. Tomorrow, I would call Mark, not to plead or to argue, but to remind him, gently, firmly, of what was real. It was time to reclaim what Henry and I had built together. It was time to stand again, not out of anger, but out of love for myself. It took me 3 days to pick up the phone. 3 long days of pacing the hallway, replaying every moment, every comment, every laugh that had once filled this house, I told myself I just wanted to hear his voice, my son's voice, to know there was still love beneath all the noise. When I finally dialed, my hands shook so hard I had to steady the phone against my knee. I thought he might sound worried, maybe even ashamed. I imagined him saying he didn't know about the post, that he would talk to Lindsay, that he still cared how I felt. But what I got instead was distance. Polite, practiced distance. He said things that sounded reasonable, careful, the kind of words people use when they want to sound kind while shutting the door on you. He told me I was overreacting, that Lindsay hadn't meant any harm, that maybe I was just sensitive lately. As he spoke, something inside me started to ache in a place I didn't even know existed. My chest tightened. My throat felt raw. I could hear the same child who once ran to me after every scraped knee, now defending the woman who humiliated me. My own son, the boy I raised to know right from wrong, was now telling me that what I felt didn't matter. For a moment, I thought I might break, but as he kept talking, a strange calm settled over me. It was like watching a glass shatter in slow motion. The shock fades, and all that's left is clarity. I realized then that this wasn't new. For years, I had let small dismissals pass, mistaking silence for peace. Every time I bit my tongue, every time I said it's fine, I had trained him to believe I would always bend. The call ended, not with shouting, but with something colder, resignation. He hung up first, and when the silence returned, it wasn't painful anymore. It was cleansing. I sat for a long time in that quiet. My heart beat steady again. Then I reached for my planner, found the card my lawyer had given me years ago, and dialed another number. My voice didn't tremble this time. I simply told her we needed to talk about the house. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept without tears. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to see my worth. The next morning, I would uncover something far worse than the post. But that night, I had peace. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The air felt heavy with quiet purpose. I told myself I was only looking for the property deed, just to confirm what I already knew, that the house was still in my name. But when I opened the drawer where I kept old tax receipts and bills, something told me to keep digging. The scent of paper and dust filled the air as I pulled folders out one by one. Years of life in manila envelopes, mortgage statements, utility bills, insurance renewals. Henry had always called this drawer our paper trail of love. Every page was proof of a promise we had kept: stability, security, home. At first, I wasn't looking for anything else. But then a small credit card statement caught my eye. The account was under my name, yet the charges didn't belong to me. Designer handbags, hotel stays, a charge from a spa in Savannah. I hadn't left Charleston in years. My stomach tightened. I checked another month. More of the same. New shoes, electronics, dinner reservations for two. Each statement led me further down a path I didn't want to walk. I traced the dates, the amounts, the pattern. The purchases had started small, almost invisible, then grew bolder over time. And the name that appeared on the shipping addresses? Lindsay's? My hands began to tremble, but I forced myself to keep going. I searched through my files until I found the property tax documents. That's when the final blow came. The most recent form showed a new authorization, one I hadn't signed. My son's handwriting stared back at me, shaky but familiar. Mark's name beside mine. Forged. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. It wasn't just money they had taken. It was trust, dignity, and the legacy Henry and I had built with every sacrifice we'd made. I sat there, surrounded by the quiet rustle of papers, realizing that the theft hadn't begun with credit cards or forged forms. It had begun the day I stopped asking questions. The day I decided love meant silence. But silence had cost me everything. I took a deep breath and began stacking the papers neatly, one on top of the other. The credit card statements, the tax forms, the forged signature. My hands were steady now. I wasn't shaking anymore. The truth had cut deep, but it had also cleared the fog. I placed the last document in a folder, labeling it in my mind, evidence, not vengeance. I didn't need anger. I needed clarity. As I closed the drawer, I whispered to myself the words that had begun to guide me through the wreckage, truth over revenge. I would face them, not to destroy them, but to remind them, and myself, what integrity truly meant. Outside, the magnolia tree swayed in the breeze, its white blossoms falling like small pieces of light. I watched one drift down and land softly on the porch step. Roots, I thought. They may be buried, but they hold everything upright. The house was silent that night, the kind of silence that seems to listen back. I sat at the dining table with every document spread before me. The bank statements, the forged signatures, the proof that could unravel everything they'd built. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, steady and low, like a heartbeat reminding me I was still here. I looked at the papers and understood the power they carried. With a single phone call, I could end it all. The law was on my side. I could make them answer for every dollar, every lie, every insult they'd wrapped in politeness. But the thought of it, the image of my son being dragged through court, of my grandchildren hearing whispers at school, filled me with a sorrow deeper than any betrayal. Justice and revenge looked too much alike in the dark. My eyes drifted to the window. The first hint of dawn was softening the edges of the night. The sky bruised, but clearing. That light reminded me of Henry, steady, kind, and endlessly patient. I could almost hear his voice, low and certain, reminding me that strength doesn't always mean striking back. Sometimes it means knowing when to stand still. I thought about what he would have done if he were here. He would have looked at me the way he always did when I was angry, not to calm me, but to remind me who I was. And I realized in that moment that I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired of being hurt. Yes, but more than that, I was done giving my pain away to people who hadn't earned it. Forgiveness doesn't erase what they did. It doesn't excuse the lies or the theft or the humiliation, but it frees me from carrying the weight of their choices. And maybe that was what Henry meant all those years, that pride built on mercy lasts longer than any revenge ever could. I wiped my eyes and began stacking the papers carefully, one by one, the same way I used to fold Mark's clothes when he was small. Each page felt lighter than the last. By the time I placed them back in the drawer, my hands were steady again. Outside, The birds had begun to stir, a few soft notes of life returning to the morning. I stood, feeling the ache in my knees, and breathed in the cool air that slipped through the open window. Tomorrow, I would face them, not as a victim, not even as a mother desperate for apology. I would face them as a woman who had remembered her worth. The sun was rising, and for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to meet the light. I heard their car before I saw it, the low hum of the engine, the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. I had been waiting at the kitchen table, my hands resting lightly on the folder in front of me. Every paper inside was a piece of the truth I had gathered: the forged documents, the bank statements, the proof of what they had done. Yet in that moment, I felt no fury, only stillness, the kind that comes after a long storm when the world finally exhales. When they stepped inside, I could see the unease in their faces. Mark's eyes darted around, avoiding mine. Lindsay's smile was tight, the kind people wear when they know the ground beneath them has begun to shift. They were expecting tears, maybe anger. I gave them neither. I invited them to sit. The air felt heavy, yet calm, like a courtroom before the verdict. I could hear the faint ticking of the old clock Henry had repaired years ago. It reminded me that time, no matter how cruel or kind, always brings the truth to light. I began to speak slowly, carefully. I told them what I had found: the credit card statements, the false signatures, the misuse of trust. My voice didn't tremble. Every word was measured, anchored in fact. I watched Mark's face change as I laid each piece of evidence before them. Shock gave way to shame, then to something smaller, a hollow understanding that could no longer hide behind excuses. Lindsay stayed quiet, her expression collapsing into the mask of someone who had run out of lies. For once, the silence was hers to bear. Then, I slid the final envelope across the table, the legal notice reclaiming the house. My name, still printed boldly across the deed, was my quiet declaration. I explained that they would have 60 days to leave. No accusations, no raised voice, just the calm delivery of consequence. Mark's breath caught, and I saw the boy he used to be flicker through his eyes, the one who once brought me dandelions and called them flowers. He tried to speak, but the words fell apart in the air between us. I didn't need to hear them. The apology wasn't for me anymore. It was for him to carry. For a moment, he wept. Not the loud, desperate kind of crying that seeks forgiveness, but the broken sound of recognition. It wasn't victory I felt watching him. It was release. A slow unbinding of every expectation, every old dream of what our family should have been. When it was over, I stood and walked them to the door. The morning light spilled across the porch, soft and golden. I told them to take care of themselves, to rebuild what was left with honesty this time. Then I closed the door behind them. The latch clicked softly, the most peaceful sound I had heard in years. I stood for a long while in the quiet. The house felt lighter, almost breathing with me again. Dust floated in the sunlight, and the magnolia tree outside cast gentle shadows on the wall. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt whole, not because I had won, but because I had chosen peace over chaos, truth over vengeance. As I sat back down at the table, the morning breeze slipped through the window, carrying the faint scent of blooming magnolia. I closed my eyes and whispered a small prayer of gratitude for the lesson, for the strength, for the silence that had finally become my own. Tomorrow, I would wake to a new chapter. But that morning, I simply sat in the sunlight, letting the weight of years lift from my shoulders, one steady breath at a time. The days after they left were quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. The air in the house seemed softer, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath for too long. The mornings became slower, gentler. I'd wake up to the sound of birds outside the kitchen window, make a small pot of coffee, and sit at the same table where so much had been lost and reclaimed. For a while, I kept expecting the ache to return, the kind that had lived inside me for so long, it had almost felt like home. But instead, there was calm. The kind that doesn't erase the past, but accepts it, folds it neatly, and sets it down. I've thought a lot about what happened, about love, and what it means to give without losing yourself. I used to believe that being a good mother meant putting everyone else first. I mistook silence for grace, forgiveness for surrender. But I've learned that love without self-respect isn't love at all. It's a slow fading, one that takes pieces of you until you hardly recognize the woman in the mirror. Forgiving them didn't mean pretending it never happened. It meant setting myself free from carrying their choices on my shoulders. I didn't need to punish them to reclaim my worth. All I had to do was remember who I was before the hurt and step back into her life. Now, when the sunlight filters through the window and dances across the floorboards Henry and I once polished together, I feel him here, not as a memory of grief, but as a quiet presence of pride. I know he would tell me I did the right thing, that sometimes strength looks like walking away without slamming the door. To anyone listening who has ever been made to feel small, whether by family, by betrayal, or by love that demanded too much, I want you to know this. You are allowed to take your power back. You are allowed to say, enough. Peace doesn't come from revenge. It comes from remembering your worth and refusing to hand it away again. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, but it brought me home, to myself, to peace, to truth. Have you ever faced something like this? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you have, I hope you find what I did, the quiet strength to begin again, one morning at a time.